Hey, it's Chris, Liege Games. 2 for 1 today. We get Prehistories and we get Prehistories Evolutions. Tile laying, family weight. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this, a little bit about what this adds, and then I'll let you know what I think. Let's do this. So here we have what is just your basic board. There's a little bit of asymmetry between the various colors in terms of these tile placements that get put out in the beginning, and then these allow you to draw extra cards with the hands. But the basic gist of this is you're going to be taking these tiles, placing them along the left side here in the correct orientation, because orientation really matters. You can see the little animals on these, and that's where it really comes in. You have to be careful because all of the orientations are going to be slightly different. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to place these in order to complete the end game objectives, and you have 3 end game scoring conditions in every game that are going to be present, and then you're going to put a couple other select variable ones in there. And so when you achieve one of these, row, column, or legendary monster placement, you get to put one of your little tokens in that area. And so these you can do as many times as you can. However, we also have the variable ones that are going to go along with this, and you can see a little bit of everything here. These are the easy side, and then there is the more advanced side. And so on the difference is this, you get 2 for the first person that does it. So the first person that filled the far right column here is going to put 2 of their little tokens down here. Everyone else that then subsequently achieves it only gets 1. You can only do each one of these cards once. The rest are going to have to be made up through this. So how do you get these pieces on your board, Chris? Well, then let's bring this over to the base game board here, and you can see that these various tokens are going to be laid out on this board in order to buy them. And so what we're going to do actually is we're going to split this board this way so you can see a little bit more close up what's going on here. In each of these areas, you have different values in which you can buy cards. This token right here, the single token, you can buy for 1 to 3 or 4. You can buy this double token right here for 4 to 6 or 7. Now, if you pay 1 to 3 in terms of the card values, which we'll talk here in a second, you get a wound. If you pay 4 or more, you don't. 4 to 6, take a wound. 7 or higher, take no wounds. And then you flip it over and you see the same thing. And the higher pieces, you see the 4, and 4 actually has 2 different arrangements right there. 10 to 12 gets a wound, 13 or higher doesn't. Then you see up here, you have the 3 piece that gets laid in here, and 7 to 9 gets a wound, 10 plus doesn't. Now, you also have the legendary beasts down here, same thing, 13, 15, 16 plus, blah, 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 blah. You understand the concept. Well, what happens though, is that when you're looking at this, you're looking at this board and there is a piece out there, 1 piece for every single round for all of the various players. And so what you're doing is you're looking at your hand, and you usually have about 3 cards, potentially more, potentially less, and you're looking at the values in this upper left-hand corner. And that is the value that you're going to be matching to these values that you're paying. And so you lay down as many of those cards as you want on your turn. You can lay all of them down, you can lay none of them down. And that's also going to affect how you draw, and that's where the wounds come in as well. So what you do is you look at this sum total, and you can divide it up however you want. So I can pay 2 here and get this guy, I can pay 4 here and get this guy, but I get 2 wounds. If you get wounds, then the price you pay is how many cards you're drawing back, right? I've played all 4 of my cards, I have 2 wounds, that means from my deck now I don't get to draw any. If you don't take any wounds, you draw 2 cards. If you take 1 wound, you draw 1 card. If you don't buy any pieces, you actually get to draw 3. So if I decided I'm really going to go for the legendary, I'm going to draw these 3. All of a sudden, 5, 6, 6, 1, 1, 2, 2. Now I really have a huge hand, and I can potentially not only get 1, but I might be able to get a couple of these larger ones to now then play on said board in the first place. That is the gist of the game. You'll see the number in the upper right hand corner because let's say, I play 5 only on that one, and then someone else plays a 2 and that. And then you look at, if this were to be, 2 different colors here, you look at the speed of the fastest runner. So the higher the number, the slower the runner. So this guy has a 58. So this team would actually go first. They would get to the hunting grounds first to find the animals. And then this would go second. And so that's how it's going to go. And you go until somebody achieves the end game scoring of all 8 of these little tokens placed. Now, there are some nuances. There's some variables. In the base game alone, that's the core concept. The first expansion that came out with it is the shield expansion, this little guy right here. Essentially what it does is if you play this card, it doesn't have a value here, doesn't have a value here, but if you play it, it blocks a wound that you might have acquired on this phase, so you can be able to draw in a better position later on. Now that we've covered the base game, let's talk about evolutions a second. What does evolutions bring? Well, evolution brings you 4 separate, not really campaign-esque, but different modules that you can mix and match from that are going to do 2 things in terms of the stuff we just talked about. One is going to affect this board in some way, shape, or form, overlays or potential add-ons. The other is going to give you variability in your card deck, like the Shield Gentleman that we just discussed. Now, without going into too many spoilers, I'm going to give you a brief overview sort of what else to expect. So, for example, you take one of these out, and you may all of a sudden now have an area that instead of only having one of these tiles in, maybe it gives you the ability to have 2 different tiles. Maybe it changes the value over here. The other aspect that maybe one of these does is that now if you get a wound at one of these locations, you actually have to discard a card permanently from your hunting party out of the game, which may or may not be a bad thing in terms of thinning your deck if you're familiar with that deck building concept. You may also have hunter cards that powers or strengths in the upper left-hand corner that I talked about. Maybe they are now going to be different. If they're by themselves, they may be super strong, but if they're with a party, their party power may be lessened. Or maybe you have a hunter that specializes in getting there first and finding the animals, so you automatically win the initiative. How does that sound? All little different variable pieces there. And if you were paying attention, you'll notice that all of these pieces in the core game all have the same animals, which go to some of the objectives that we sort of mentioned. Well, what if we started having multiple animals on each tile? That's going to change the patterns and the recognition that you may be able to use to your advantage in some of those row and column completion objectives that are needed. The last thing, though, is speaking of those objectives, maybe we have a new way to combine objectives to make them slightly more interesting, slightly more nuanced, or even slightly more difficult if those other ones I mentioned were a little too easy from that aspect of things. Intrigued? Well, you've got 4 different modules here that are allowing you all of those different ways that I just showed you and talked about to manipulate without spoiling things too much in detail. Now, it does say with some of these modules, some of them are better mixed with one than another. You can't necessarily just throw them all down onto the table and play with all of them, because they do come with some boards that will overlap these areas, change the shape of the area, change the pricing of the area, and give a different effect. So you need to be careful about which ones you can mix and match. It recommends, it talks about that in the each individual rules of about 1.5 pages in each one of these. So there's no confusion, there's no worrying from that aspect of things. And they can all ultimately go with the base game in terms of compatibility. So there you go. Those are the thoughts on evolution, and a little bit of spoilers without going into too much detail, but definitely adding some more depth. Let's talk. So we're gonna do something a little bit different here. I'm gonna tell you my opinion, my final opinion at the end, right? This is the part of the video that you all skip over to. Final thoughts, pros and cons, and then we'll get into what the gameplay actually looks like. The gameplay is actually relatively intuitive. The biggest difference between this and a lot of other tile layers is that you have to always start over on the, my left-hand side of your board, the first most open space on that element of things. And so the strategy really evolves once you realize how big of a deal that is and how it changes the in-game scoring and the, rows and columns scoring. In that sense, the first one to get all 8 of their victory markers placed. And then you start to realize how sometimes little the taking wounds matters. So pros and cons. Pro, it's an easy family weight style game with a little bit of nuance that changes once you start to play a little bit more. You start to realize that this is not meant to be an elegant tile laying game, a la several of the other ones out there where you're trying to make the prettiest tile and trying to maximize and optimize. No, this is a race to fill spots in a certain way. Now, my problem with other tile laying games like this, like Copenhagen from Queen Games that I have over my closet there, it seemed to be very rote and repetition based, right? That everything was the same. And you can say that a little bit about a lot of these with the nature of them by the fact that they play 30 minutes and their family weight. It's going to have a little bit more of that. And so the base game has that. And then the question is, how do you feel about expansions that, I don't want to say fix things, because that's not really fixing, it's not really broken, but adding another layer on layer in terms of the puzzle-like nature of this speed racer tile layer, if you will. The evolutions with the different boards overlaying, with the actual orientation matters. And that's the other big difference that this does that a lot of other tile layers don't, is orientation. There's like, you know, you can flip it, you can twist it, you can, you know, turn it all this way, as long as you don't, whatever, you know, break it and put it in two separate places, you can do that. With this one, the nature of the little animals on there, you have to actually have them face up. And so that's going to potentially change your strategy once you realize that as well. Those are the two big main differences that are going to appeal to you or not. You also start to realize that those arrows that I mentioned, the damage that you're going to take, allowing you to draw less cards, well, heck, that's a damage worth taking. I mean, we're always so prone to try and avoid those things, it feels like, or we're programmed to try and do so. Well, this game sort of takes that notion out of your head and forces you, if you want to succeed, to, you know, have some rounds where you just don't get any tiles, so you can get 2 or 3 other tiles on a different round in order to maximize boom, 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 boom in the race that I mentioned, because then you can go further in both directions. What you may not like, well, it's random card drawing. It's random card drawing from the deck, and you're just not going to get the numbers you need. The biggest con right now is that it's just not doing anything necessarily different, although the combination of the tile laying with the initiative values of the cards in the first place is something slightly unique. Now, I'll go into a little spoilers here, as I did with the video, of what Evolutions does. You know, there's the 4 modules, and you're having the modularity of being able to add them to the base game. But the biggest problem with this is like if you play Terraforming Mars, right? And you add in all of the expansions, it does become a little bit... And if you were to play with all 4 of these, I don't think you actually can, because it actually says only play with like these 2 or these 2. And so that's the big nice thing, that it doesn't get too crowded at the same time of trying to remember 4 different rules. The cards of each of them are very easily integratable. The shield card from the other expansion for the base game, very easy concepts to throw in there, buff your deck essentially, and, you know, make it a little bit more oomphy, but without making you too much this, right? I mean, that's the problem with something like Isle of Skye's first expansion. There was way too much of this, and it lost the elegant simplicity that was the first appeal of it in the original sense. If you're looking for something family style, this is going to appeal aesthetically, this is going to appeal gameplay wise, it's going to appeal lengthwise. It is definitely among the shorter tile layers that you're looking at from that aspect. Ultimately, though, it's probably a little bit too light, to be frank with you, especially the base game alone, to stay in my collection. Although I'm tempted to say at the same time, this would be a much better one to import my kids into, rather than something like Isle of Skye, or even the one I just reviewed a couple weeks ago, Acropolis. And that is ultimately the mass appeal, right? If I can get it played, I can't get my kids to play Isle of Skye. There's too much nuance there right now. This would easily bridge that gap. And the question is whether or not you have a bridge like that that needs gap spanning. If you don't, well, it's probably going to be an easy pass. But if you like this style of things, it's probably going to suit your needs pretty well. It's also, at the same time, not going to create the barn burning tile placement, Isle of Cats style situations that you may be craving if you're looking for something heavier, and that's okay. It's not meant to be that way. Ultimately, like I said, I mean, this is one where I think I would have to test it with my kids. I didn't play it with my kids, but I think it would be worth testing with the kids, because I could see them going either way. If I had my own say, just, you know, without having kids, I'd probably pass on it again, like I said, because I think it's just a little bit too light overall for my personal tastes. But that doesn't make it a bad game. It just makes it, how much do you like those mechanisms by any means? So there you go. Take that for what it is. Those are my final thoughts. Thanks for watching. Stay classy. See you around.